Vessel Ohala, this is U.S. naval warship off your starboard quarter on channel 23, over.
I'm in.
What is the nationality of your vessel, over?
United States.
Roger, skipper. Stand by and prepare to be boarded by the United States Coast Guard. Good afternoon, Captain. My name's Officer Smith, and this is my boarding team, and we're with the United States Coast Guard.
I don't understand. We were just out fishing.
We're here today to make sure that your vessel is in compliance with all federal laws and regulations.
Following a tip from a confidential informant, the United States Coast Guard detained the Ohala, a fishing boat suspected of transporting cocaine into the United States. At the time, authorities had no idea that this inspection would erupt into one of the most dramatic high-speed pursuits in the history of the war against drugs.
The Ohala was brought to Key West, Florida, and subjected to an exhaustive search by the U.S. Coast Guard.
Yeah, I got something in here.
500 kilos of cocaine, valued at over $10 million, were discovered aboard the Ohala. Captain John Moreno was charged with possession of cocaine with intent to distribute.
Mr. Moreno, how do you plead to these charges?
Not guilty.
Over the 4-day trial, John Moreno maintained his innocence, but was ultimately found guilty. The prosecutor responsible for the conviction was Assistant United States Attorney Ed Allen.
Once John Moreno was sentenced, and his sentence was a 30-year imprisonment, then John came to his senses. He contacted the government through his attorney, and he told me that he was willing to cooperate, and we welcome John's cooperation.
John Moreno met with DEA Special Agent Robert Riley and Ed Allen.
Mr. Moreno, what we need to know is who hired you to do the smuggling of the cocaine?
Armando Garcia.
John Moreno told us about Armando Garcia and Armando Garcia's involvement in the smuggling of the 500 kilograms of cocaine aboard the Ohala.
Armando Garcia was a notorious high-level smuggler who had been under investigation for years.
Armando Garcia was in fact a dangerous man. He had broken out of prison in the early 1980s from the prison in the Bahamas. He was reputed to have been a violent person.
The Ohala is Garcia's boat.
John Moreno essentially laid out what he knew about the organization.
They fly the loads out of Colombia and airdrop them to go-fast boats, which bring them into Florida.
The U.S. Customs Service initiated surveillance of Garcia's flight route, anticipating his next shipment. On November 7th, radar detected a suspicious aircraft en route from Colombia to Garcia's airdrop site.
Customs 4 Alpha 1917 is running emergency code southbound US 1.
Special Agent Tim Collins rushed to the Customs headquarters in Key Largo to supervise the operation.
We got an airdrop working up off the north coast of Cuba near Cayo Francis. I was very excited. Immediately you start feeling that adrenaline rush begin because you have a lot of different thoughts that are racing through your head. What's the status of your helicopter?
Collins dispatched a Coast Guard Jayhawk helicopter and a nearby Customs citation jet to the scene.
Echo 1900, Lima 52, be advised, we're showing a possible target at 60 miles out. Bad news, he looks like he's heading towards Cuban airspace.
The suspect aircraft was flying in toward the Cuban Air Defense Identification Zone, and we're not permitted to penetrate the Cuban ADES.
Lima 5-2, home plate, Roger, understand, request contact Command Center for authorization to penetrate the Cuban ADES, stand by, over.
It was really a moment of pretty high suspense because the aircraft were all moving rapidly closer to this demarcation point beyond which we couldn't maintain track on the aircraft without approval from the Cuban authorities.
As the suspect aircraft slipped into Cuban airspace, Coast Guard District 7 attempted to contact the Cuban authorities for permission to follow. Meanwhile, the Citation jet continued surveillance from U.S. airspace.
Okay, that's a Mike boat moving in.
The Citation crew spotted a vessel approaching the drop location.
Our Customs Citation was able to identify the pickup vessel, and they saw that it was about a 25 to 30 foot center console, go-fast type vessel, as we call it, powered by twin outboard motors.
Great. Subject's opening the door. Watch out for the drop there, 8 Alpha.
They were able to actually observe the drop of the narcotics occur, and it was a classic airdrop activity.
After dropping the bales of cocaine, the suspect aircraft disappeared into Cuban airspace. While officials waited for a response from the Cuban government, the Coast Guard Jayhawk, under the command of DEA Country Attaché Tom Hill, arrived at the border.
I didn't think that we would actually receive permission to be able to enter into Cuban airspace, which was a very frustrating feeling. We knew that there was an airdrop happening. We knew for sure that there would be a substantial amount of cocaine on this boat, and I was very concerned that the boat would remain in Cuban waters until we had burned all our fuel and had to return to base.
Be advised, we're showing bales in the water, and the go-fast is maneuvering to recover the bales at this time.
There's nothing more frustrating than witnessing a crime basically happen right in front of you and not be able to pursue the perpetrators and effect an arrest.
U.S. law enforcement agents had Armando Garcia's speedboat in their sights, but it had crossed into Cuban waters. Authorities knew that if they did not obtain permission to continue the operation from Fidel Castro's government, the drug runners would escape.
U.S. Coast Guard District 7 in Miami contacted Cuban authorities and received permission to continue tracking the vessel.
When we got word that we could enter Cuban airspace, we were all excited. The adrenaline, which was already pumping, was bumped up another notch.
While the Citation jet continued to track the vessel from just over 1,000 feet above the water, the Jayhawk helicopter entered Cuban airspace in pursuit.
Immediately, the boat began to take evasive action, doing donuts in the water, trying to maneuver back around behind the helicopter. We began to see them throwing the bales into the water in an attempt to have us concentrate more on the bales of cocaine in the water and to break off pursuit.
The Jayhawk crew remained fixed on the go-fast boat and maintained their pursuit as night fell over the ocean.
Every several minutes or so, he would make evasive maneuvers. He would go dead in the water. Once you lose the wake of a moving boat, it is very difficult to reacquire it if he stays dead in the water. Every time he would make one of these evasive maneuvers, we did eventually reacquire the boat, would light them up again. As soon as we lit them up, and they would start to head back again in a general northwest direction.
As the pursuit continued, both the Customs Citation and the Coast Guard Jayhawk reached critical stage. They got close to the end of their fuel reserves, and they got to the point where they'd have to return to base to fuel.
After 4 hours of pursuit, the Jayhawk and Citation jet were relieved by a Customs Nomad tracker plane.
There were a number of problems that the Nomad had in trying to maintain the pursuit. The first problem was the fact that it was a very dark night. There was very little ambient light. There was no moon. There was a low ceiling with low scattered clouds. They couldn't see anything with the naked eye. The second problem was that it was also very humid, and the high humidity created a sort of haze around the surface of the water, which degraded the ability of the infrared system to track the target.
No, I've lost him. We'll try to reacquire, but I don't think we're going to be able to.
We were all very disappointed when we found out that they had lost the contact, and basically we were back to square one. At that point, we were about 3.5, 4 hours into the chase. The chances of being able to find a small 25 to 30-foot fiberglass boat, it was going to be a very difficult problem for us.
After learning of the Nomad's misfortune, Agent Hill and his Jayhawk crew leapt into action.
We wanted to get back out there, and we wanted to get out there as soon as we could. We launched, we did our search patterns, didn't have a lot of success at first. Then we all agreed that what we should do was to go back to where we actually handed off the Go Fast boat to the customs jet, and then proceed on that same course, which is what we did. And eventually pilots saw a small light off in the distance several miles, and that little speck of light was the light on their compass.
The boat was in American waters, heading toward the Florida Keys.
We came up behind them and again picked up the pursuit.
I decided at that point, as the boat got to within about 10 miles of shore, to explore the possibility of other law enforcement agencies participating. So I called the Florida Marine Patrol's dispatcher. We've got a suspect vessel that's approximately 10 miles offshore heading toward the Marathon or Craig Key area.
Officer Tim Hardy was called into action by the Florida Marine Patrol.
U.S. Customs advises via landline that they are in pursuit of a suspected pickup vessel from an airdrop.
As the vessel continued to get closer to shore, we were getting pretty concerned because the one thing we didn't want was for them to be able to reach shore. We didn't want to get in a situation where we were in a foot chase or we had these people hiding in the mangroves or possibly fleeing in vehicles. So we really wanted to make sure that we got the boat stopped on the high seas and got the people in custody on board the boat.
As the vessel neared shore, the pursuing law enforcement officers got a lucky break.
They ran over a lobster buoy, the attached line for a lobster pot, and this fouled one of their two props and basically took one of their two 200 horsepower engines offline. So this dramatically reduced their speed. And then around this time, Tim Hardy got into range to actually do the intercept.
Stop the boat now! Stop the boat!
At first they weren't complying. These guys had run hard all night and just weren't giving up. And you could tell that they were looking for a place to go ashore and run if they could. And finally, Tim was able to maneuver his vessel in a position where he was able to level a shotgun at them and order them to stop.
Don't do it! Put your hands up! Everyone get your hands up!
They finally turned the engines off.
Within minutes, a customs interceptor boat picked up the 4 drug smugglers.
U.S. Customs! Put your hands up! Move to the front of the boat, Captain! Now!
The men were taken to the Isla Mirada customs station, where authorities learned that they had in custody the notorious drug smuggler, Armando Garcia.
After an historic high-speed chase into Cuban waters, infamous drug lord Armando Garcia was finally in custody, but his illegal cargo had been thrown overboard, and DEA agents feared their case against Garcia was literally lost at sea.
Assistant United States Attorney Ed Allen, who had prosecuted John Moreno, was assigned to the Armando Garcia case. Allen learned that the Cuban Coast Guard had found some of the jettisoned cocaine which had washed up on shore.
Encontramos 200 kilos de cocaína cerca de la punta donde lo botaron.
Muy bien, muy bien. Tenemos la documentación.
DEA officials met with the Cuban officials, and the Cuban officials gave the DEA approximately 100 grams of cocaine, which was a sample from the drugs thrown overboard.
Is there any direct evidence linking this cocaine to the defendant?
Just prior to trial, we met with the judge, and we discussed the possibility of bringing the sample of cocaine into that trial as evidence against Armando. He says, you don't have any chain of custody, it's all hearsay. He says that's not going to come into this case.
For all we know, this cocaine could have come from anywhere. It belonged to anyone.
Without the physical evidence, Allen knew his case was in jeopardy.
We were at a distinct disadvantage because this was a drug case, but we had no drugs.
We will show you today that Mr. Armando Garcia, the defendant, is guilty of the crimes that we've charged him with.
Our strategy in the opening statement was that we would tell the jury that Armando Garcia had been involved in a drug conspiracy and had been out in the open seas running from the United States law enforcement officers, the customs people, and the Coast Guard for approximately 5 hours.
And the reason you won't be seeing any of the drugs today is because they threw them into the ocean.
And we asked some questions that they should be asking themselves as to why these men would have been out in rough seas, running 5-foot waves at a time when they were under investigation for drug smuggling.
As I came on the scene in a helicopter, I witnessed the men in the boat loading 12 bales of cocaine.
The prosecution called DEA Country Attaché Tom Hill to the stand.
Later, after the arrest, we went back and tried to find the bales of cocaine, but were unsuccessful.
Bales of cocaine. How do you know what was inside the bales? Were you able to look inside them?
No, sir. We were 150 feet above the water.
Well, then there's no way of knowing for sure what was inside them. Isn't that correct?
The defense basically made a big deal out of the fact that there weren't any drugs, that the jury wouldn't see any drugs, that they wouldn't hear about any drugs.
As the jury went out for deliberation, Prosecutor Allen feared that the lack of direct evidence could lead to an acquittal. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with its verdict.
Will the defendant please rise while the verdict is read?
We, the jury, find the defendant, Armando Garcia, not guilty.
At the conclusion of the trial, which resulted in the acquittal, Armando hadn't slipped through the government's fingers. He knew, and the government knew, that he was involved in the importation of 500 kilograms of cocaine aboard the Ohala, and he knew that we could charge him with that.
Prosecutor Allen indicted Garcia for the Ohala bust. And this time, he had not only the drugs recovered in the seizure, but also the testimony of John Moreno.
Would you please rise, Mr. Garcia?
Armando Garcia knew the case was strong and feared the 30-year sentence it carried.
Mr. Garcia, how do you plead to the above titled charges?
Guilty.
Armando Garcia entered into a plea agreement, and basically his plea agreement was that he would fully cooperate with the government and provide the government with all information that he had concerning drug smuggling, and that he would give us information concerning other co-conspirators with whom he had worked over the years.
Armando Garcia was sentenced to 10 years in a federal penitentiary, during which time he provided U.S. authorities with page upon page of information. For his cooperation, Garcia's sentence was reduced to 8 years.
Armando Garcia's invaluable information ultimately helped to convict 9 other drug traffickers and resulted in the seizure of over 4,000 pounds of cocaine. I'm Brian Dennehy. Join me for the next episode of Arrest and Trial.